When I was first invited to this conference, I was tempted to speak on the international dimension and point to the hypocrisy of much that goes into interventions on the grounds of humanitarian concern in the affairs of other countries. But I realized that this group would be involved in introspection and that we wouldn't get a lot of drum beating here, but a lot of concern as to whether, in fact, the outcomes are quite as honorable as the intentions that go into these interventions. And so I thought the honest thing for me to do would be to introspect with respect to my own country and try to see whether some of the problems that are faced by the international community with respect to human rights are not precisely the dilemmas that we in India confront when it comes to those segments of our population which are clearly much worse off than the rest of the population. And I think this has now come to some kind of a climax within my country with respect to the tribal population, the tribes who inhabit, well, you find pockets of tribes almost everywhere in the country, but they're heavily concentrated in central India and in northeast India. And the fact of the matter is that it's also in central India and northeast India, and among these tribal populations, that we are facing the problem of insurgency. Insurgency, which is called Maoism in India, simply because the insurgents call themselves Maoists, although I suspect that Chairman Mao is constantly revolving in his grave at the misuse of his own name, but they call themselves Maoists. And we had a small little area of subdivision of the state of West Bengal some 30 years ago, where there's a little town called Naxalbari, and the insurgents there, who also spoke in the name of Mao Zedong, called themselves Naxals from the name of their subdivision. And so, indifferently in India, these insurgents are referred to as Maoists, or as Naxals. And one wonders why this should have happened. For initially, the government of India's approach to these tribals was based entirely on strictly humanitarian considerations. Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, spelt these out as 5 principles for the treatment of the tribal population of India. He said these 5 principles should be: 1, that the tribal people should develop along the line of their own genius, and we should avoid imposing anything on them, but rather try to encourage in every way their own traditional arts and culture. 2nd, that tribal rights on land and forest should be respected. 3rd, that we should try to train and build up a team of their own people to do administration and development. 4th, that we should not over-administer these areas or overwhelm them with a multiplicity of schemes. We should work through and not in rivalry to their own social and cultural institutions. And 5th, we should judge the results not by statistics or the amount of money spent, but by the quality of human character that is evolved. Now, I can't imagine a more humanitarian charter than this one. And yet, where have we got as a result of 65 years of development? In these 65 years, I take the year because we became independent 65 years ago, in 1947. When we became independent, it was universally acknowledged that the single biggest problem of India was its poverty, and that therefore the development of the economy must take priority over everything else. And up to a point, we've not only had success, we've also perhaps had spectacular success, at least in some years. And because the vocabulary of the world keeps changing, depending upon the requirements of the world, when I was a student of economics, we had only 2 categories of countries: the developed and the underdeveloped. This then changed slowly, particularly through the United Nations, to being developed, developing, and least developed. And now we have a fourth category. We say developed, emerging, developing, and underdeveloped or least developed. So most people congratulate us on having graduated from being a developing country to being an emerging nation. And Indians, particularly Indian diplomats, including the Indian ambassador who's sitting here, simper modestly when they're told what a remarkable country India is and how the Chinese are the only ones ahead of us, but that we are well ahead of the rest of the world. We are undergoing a recession in India where the growth rate is about 6% per annum. And Europe is undergoing a recession where the growth rate is perhaps less than zero. So in these circumstances, a lot of praise is showered upon our development, and our perception in 1947 that development was desirable is now being converted into an international desire to make development in India desirable. Because with about 200 million people now having money enough in their pockets to go occasionally into a shopping mall, the West finds that we have an emerging market in India for 200 million people, which is equal to the populations of Germany, France, and the United Kingdom combined. And that moreover, we have great opportunities of investment in India at a time when investment opportunities are drying up in the West. And so we tend to be the flavor of the month at Davos and other gatherings of people who believe in the market, people who believe that the Indian model of development should be based upon the successful Western model of development as against the unsuccessful socialist model of development. But the problem is that while we have 200 million Indians who've really zoomed into the first world, we have 1 billion Indians who haven't anywhere near ridden this high trajectory of growth. And the least deprived of all these are the tribal people of India. They constitute only 8% of the population of India. But when it comes to displacement caused by development, on an average, 55% of those who are displaced are tribal people. And in the state that has recently been most lauded for its growth rates, the official documents of the Planning Commission say that 76% of those who've been displaced are tribal people, and in that particular state, the share of the tribals in the total population is not 8%, but nearer 2 or 3%. These are also the people who have the highest levels of poverty in India. They're the ones who have the least levels of literacy in India. There are some districts where Adivasi women or women belonging to the tribal groups have literacy rates of under 10% per annum. Very high rates of infant mortality, about double the rate for the country as a whole. Very high rates of maternal mortality, and malnutrition is rampant. Now, development is meant for them too. Their problem is that they live in dense forest areas. And dense forest areas are precisely the areas where you have lots of lovely minerals under the ground. And you can't get to these minerals unless you displace the people who live above them. And equally, for the very, very lucrative timber trade, it's the wealth that grows above their land that is most desired. And so in much the same way that there was a ruthless exploitation in North America, of which the president was talking at lunchtime, where the local people were simply driven off their land in order to, and then others were imported from Africa, in order to produce a development model which said if land is free, because we've robbed the locals of it, and if labor is free, because we're not going to pay any wages for them, then all we need is a little bit of capital to become the world's most powerful economic entity. And equally in Southern America, the kind of exploitation that was undertaken by the conquistadores would provide me, particularly because I come from the third world, a golden opportunity to start reprimanding all of you for being so concerned about human rights in the third world when you have been so neglectful of human rights in the first world. But I want to avoid doing that because it is none other than the Prime Minister of India who has explained why it's precisely these areas where we've had these allegedly these five principles of looking in a humanitarian way after the tribal people. It's the Prime Minister of India, the current Prime Minister of India, who in a public speech has said this. What are the reasons for the underdevelopment of the tribals? And I quote him. He says, exploitation, artificially depressed wages, iniquitous socio-political circumstances, inadequate employment opportunities, lack of access to resources, underdeveloped agriculture, geographical isolation, lack of land reforms, all contribute significantly to the growth of the Naxalite movement, that is the movement of the insurgents. And he added in the same speech that it would not be an exaggeration to say that the problem of Naxalism, that is the problem of tribal insurgency, is the single biggest internal security challenge ever faced by our country and has now spread to over 160 districts all over the country. We have a total of about 600 districts, which means that between a quarter and one-third of the districts of India are undergoing an insurgency in a country which can correctly claim to be the world's largest democracy. And why is this happening? It is because of the wealth, the natural wealth of the land where these very, very poor people live. And you can't get India as a developed country or become even more than an emerging nation unless we export a large amount of minerals to China to enable them to grow faster than us, or to use it for our own development. For that's where the iron ore is, that is where the coal is, that is where the bauxite is from which aluminium comes. These are minerals which are critical, crucial to development. And a lot of granite that you get in the Western world has its origins under the soil where the tribal people of India live. And obviously, it's also self-evident that our timber is of exceptional value. I think few in this audience would know that the ship on which Nelson sailed to win the Battle of Trafalgar was made in India. And that's how good our oak is in India. So we have this enormous wealth, and we have to exploit it if we are to become a developed country. But in the process of becoming a developed country, we have already displaced, say, the official documents of the Planning Commission of India in the last 60 years. It says that we displaced 60 million tribal people. And since that's an average of 1 million a year, I would imagine that figure has now reached 65 million. And there's a very, very knowledgeable Indian lady journalist, a young woman, who has explained what it means to be displaced. She says in this book of hers called Known Turf, she writes, displacement is a very inadequate word that conveys nothing of its true meaning. Displacement is not about moving. It is about losing a river, losing access to clean, safe drinking water, losing land that is watered richly, losing the grass that your herds grazed on, losing your cattle, losing the milk that came from your cattle, losing honey and herbs, losing the right to protest when somebody in a uniform shows up to set fire to your house. What else is left to lose? So these are the fundamental reasons why the poorest and least armed Indians, for if others didn't come in with guns, they would still be in the bow and arrow stage, that they have risen against the state. And they've risen against the state, not actively, they're mostly passively acquiescing in the conditions that obtain in their areas. The entire movement is led by non-tribals from neighboring states who have picked up the gun for ideological reasons and have as their main objective the overthrow of the Indian democratic state. And therefore they have to be met with the gun. But it was Chairman Mao Zedong, I hope I'm not going to be arrested in India for quoting Mao here, who said that, guerrillas are fish that swim in the ocean of the people. And so without the support of the people, it's not possible for a guerrilla to succeed. And therefore what we have to do is to do what the Americans did in Florida, which is not to kill the alligators, but to drain the swamp so that the alligator is unable to live there. And draining the swamp means changing the meaning of the word development. Instead of development being about how much steel you produce, how much aluminum you produce, how many tons of iron ore you export to China or to the United States of America, to ask yourself the question, is development participatory? For what people, ordinary people, mean by development is that if they turn on the tap, water should flow through it. That the water shouldn't get stuck in their drains. That they should have the opportunity of dismissing the school teacher if the school teacher doesn't turn up to teach, of insisting that medicines be available in the local dispensary, that the veterinary doctor comes to look after their cattle. These are the neighborhood issues which most people are most of the time concerned about. And it's only the very rich who are really concerned about rates of growth of GDP and whether the current account deficit has gone up or down. These are matters which economists are very concerned with, which businessmen are very concerned with, and which the rest of the world is mostly concerned with. But as far as the poorer people of India are concerned, when they talk development, they mean participatory development. Are they in charge of what happens in their immediate neighborhood? And that is why Rajiv Gandhi said, we may be the world's largest democracy, but we're also the world's least representative democracy. And therefore, he brought about a constitutional system of local self-government which has increased the number of elected representatives in India from about 500 in Parliament and about 4,500 in our state assemblies to the current figure in our local government institutions, all of which are elected and all of which have constitutional protection, to a figure of, just hold your breath, 3.2 million. We have 3.2 million elected representatives in India, and because we have reservations for women, the number of women in our locally elected bodies is 1.2 million already, and we are heading towards 50% reservation. So we'll soon hit 1.8 million women in our elected bodies. And this means there are more elected women in India alone than in the rest of the world put together. And we need to leverage them. But to leverage them, they have to be empowered. And that is where the politicians who got elected earlier, the ones who, like me, are in parliament or others who are in the state assemblies, are most reluctant to devolve power. And I really do believe that the single biggest form of cooperation which the Western world, the Western democratic world, can give to India is to recognize that whereas democracy in India has been a process of devolution, in Europe and in America, it's been a process of evolution. So what you take for granted as the dog catcher belonging to the local body and not appointed by the federal government is the opposite in India. The dog catcher is appointed by the central government. And therefore, what we need to understand is that even less than cooperation in exploiting our mineral resources, what we need is to pick up on your examples of grassroots democracy to promote grassroots development. And if we did that, then this exploitation of the tribals could end and they could become equal participants in a process of democratic development. And if we were to do that, not only in India, but in several other parts of the world, then I think the need for the kind of ghastly military interventions which are being repeatedly undertaken by the West in the name of humanitarian intervention could be ended, and the people themselves could be empowered to look after their own affairs. And if they were themselves in power, why would they kill each other? This is the way forward. I think we should talk less about military interventions in places like Libya and Syria, which have left behind them anarchy. I was in Iraq as a diplomat when Saddam Hussein was the favored character. We had Donald Rumsfeld come and actually embrace him, and the photograph was published in all the newspapers. And he was kissing him on both cheeks because he wanted Saddam to invade Iran, over which Iraq had no territorial claims. But Iraq has always had a territorial claim over Kuwait. And when he went in there, God, look at what happened to him twice over. And before the military intervention, there was economic intervention, which resulted in 500,000 Iraqi children dying because they couldn't get medicines into Iraq. We've seen how in Pakistan and in Afghanistan, these drone attacks are killing more people every single couple of months, than the number of people who were killed in the Twin Towers blast. So I would just plead that let's really be human rather than think in terms of using the military to create human rights. Thank you.
My name is Halla Gunnarsdóttir from the Ministry of the Interior. Thank you all for wonderful presentations and thought-provoking. I had already written down, I think, 5 questions under the first 2, and then the third added, and you know, my mind is just filled with questions and comments and lots of things I want to say. But I want to refer to the parts I was wondering about first, which is on gender and militarism, which to me sound a little bit in conflict to each other. Because military is built up on some values that in itself are threatening to women. And not only to women, but also to the nice things that we want to have in societies. And now I'm referring to the hierarchy, to the obeying demands, etc. And women, peace and security, you know, when I first started studying it, I found it very interesting and important, etc. But then I've had the chance to see it in rhetoric practice, not in practice in the field, but on how it is used by governments and more, furthermore by NATO as a military alliance, where we see CDs being delivered on women, peace and security, and the cover photo is of a man and a woman dressed in military uniforms with an Afghan girl child between them, you know, all playing around because it's such a great fun to be in a war zone with soldiers. And then it became frightening. And this is also the rhetoric that has been used by many leaders, where suddenly the ideas of women, peace and security is more about the militaries using this rhetoric to find themselves a more sustainable ground to survive, you know, more projects to work on, etc. And of course, this we have seen a lot in Afghanistan, when NATO was suddenly teaching school children to read, and one of the justifications for the war in Afghanistan was the fact that NATO was teaching 6-year-old girls to read. And I didn't understand that you would need the military alliance for that. And now I'm just getting to my point. I just want a little bit of your comments on how this has worked, watching it, from the ground, and then going up, and then it's mainly aimed at Taylor and maybe Enlo as well, and then seeing it come down again. And I mean, how does it look? How is the picture to you? I might be wrong. I'm just reflecting. It's mainly emotional, but yeah, just some comments on that.
It doesn't sound emotional to me. That sounds engaged. I'll answer one part, and then Sarah can add some specifics. One of the things that we've learned, those of us who watch militarism over a long time, one of the things that we've learned is you can militarize anything. You can militarize citizenship, you can militarize equality, you can militarize girls' education, you can militarize anything. And by that, all of us who study this and who document it, what we mean is you can take anything that you otherwise value and turn it around so that you herald it for the sake of legitimizing or expanding military resources. Does that make sense? You can militarize anything. We know you can militarize security, but you can even militarize the education of a 6-year-old girl. Insofar, so this is the thing to monitor, insofar as the thing that is being heralded so that you, the viewer, you, the listener, you, the voter, you, the donor, will actually think that it takes militarization to make that thing happen. Insofar as you're convinced of that, not only is militarization pushed forward, you are militarized.
I'm just taking notes because that's right. Yeah, I think that exactly, and to carry on from that point, my coalition and my NGO colleagues, at least on, I can say for us that is something that we are extremely concerned about. The Women, Peace, and Security movement and agenda springs from the peace movement and from a feminist movement and from the lived reality of women and their communities in conflict. It has at its core issues like disarmament and eradicating the issues of small arms and light weapons and the prevention of conflict and getting at the core of the underlying causes of conflict. And one of the challenges that we wrestle with on a daily basis is that, I call them member states, governments, whatever, must take responsibility, because there must be responsibility taken by those member states for their part in their responsibilities for this project as well. The challenge is for us as civil society, for those of you who work in government, for those in multilateral organizations, for all of us, to constantly be keeping count and to keep a hold of what the end project is. It is not to rationalize, and I think that that's the question. That's why I want you to ask those 3 questions. In whose name is what being done? Yeah? The project must be about the end, about the goal of the prevention of conflict, upholding women's rights, ensuring that we're addressing those core concerns, rather than the rationalization of additional military expenditure, which ultimately leads us to exactly the opposite goal of where we're trying to go. So, when you look at a national action plan on women, peace, and security, which is one of the ways that a member state can address its responsibilities on women, peace, and security. A national action plan should not increase a military budget, for example. That would be bad. That would be a bad indicator. A national action plan should include resources for capacity building for women's participation in peace processes, should include substantive resources and capacity for women's civil society organizations that are doing conflict prevention. That kind of work is the work that you need to track. However, as Cynthia pointed out, that kind of tracking, that kind of monitoring, that kind of counting is itself difficult, time-consuming, and takes a lot of work. So for our part in New York, one of the things that we're constantly trying to do is, when we talk about this issue about intervention, trying to keep track of and monitor where the pieces are, trying to make sure that participation does not become only about women's participation in the military, that it's about a broader discussion on women's participation in all levels of decision-making and the inclusion of women's rights in key policy documents, which is a lot harder to say in an advocacy document. But it's about constantly trying at all these different arenas to try to adhere to what those core principles are. But it's always, the broader the agenda gets, the more buy-in you get, the more opportunity there is, in short, for co-option of that agenda.
Let me just ask a quick question of Sarah. Are your working group monitoring reports, are they available online? Uh-huh. They're available. Tell them how to get it.
Oh, sure. Okay. So thanks. So one of the things that we do in the NGO working group is we put out policy documents every month telling the Security Council what it should do, but we also put out an annual report which has monitored the work of the Security Council. So we monitor the reports the Council receives, the meetings the Council holds, and all the resolutions and presidential statements the Security Council actually produces, and we monitor that for women, peace, and security, and give analysis on that. And that's available on our website, womenpeacesecurity.org.
I'm just maybe have time for one more question, short one. It's so hard to see.
Yeah, I have the mic.
I'm sorry? Over there, okay.
I don't actually have a question. My name is Steinun. I've just returned from Afghanistan, where I spent 18 months as a gender advisor for NATO. Gender advisors are a very new concept to NATO. Liked my work. I'm not necessarily for warmongering, but if NATO is going to continue doing what it does, I absolutely believe they need a gender advisor. My role there was very hard to get to people because the minute I told them who I worked for, it's the military and they didn't want to have anything to do with me. Slightly easier for me as a civilian than for my colleagues who were military. But I believe there are lots of good things being done within NATO that I've seen happening. For instance, when I arrived, the gender advisors were 7 layers from General Allen, who was the top of, who ran the operation basically, which is impossible because the minute every time I wrote something, gender would be basically taken out of it if I was trying to get something to his attention. This is changing both in Kosovo and in ISAF now. The gender advisors are right with the command group, so they can actually give advice as they're meant to do. NATO, for one, is paying a lot more attention to gender. But funnily enough, while all of a sudden I had this access to the generals, they said, this is awesome what you're doing, here's how we're going to do it. And they didn't actually necessarily listen to the approaches. So it's there's a lot of tokenism, but I actually do believe that both with the CIMIC activity, the Civ-Mil coordination and cooperation, and gender advisors, they work a lot together. There are things, like Hatla was mentioning, somebody teaching children English. There was a Spanish team of female soldiers teaching children Spanish and volleyball in one place. It's because it was very impractical, basically. And it is because NATO at the time didn't really know how to deal with gender advisors or female teams that were sent out to do specific work. This is changing. I think it can be successful, but there's a lot of work still to be done. But I actually have seen both CIMIC and gender documents on Civ-Mil coordination and gender from NATO that are improving vastly, focusing on peacekeeping and not so much war, and the role of gender advisors and anyone who deals with, for instance, religious leaders were involved in 2011 in Afghanistan. That's quite late for work in an Islamic republic where you have a lot of religious issues. So, but I think they're changing, basically, is what I want to say, that gender advisors are relevant there when listened to. Thanks.
Please join me in giving them an excellent applaud here.